We're going to wait just a couple moments. Our ranking member is on his way over, and so we won't be started immediately, but we'll be starting promptly. Let me give everyone a quick update as well. We have votes that have been called, of course, about 10:15 today, and so we're going to get started, go through this panel, opening statements and such, and see how far that we can get before they call the votes, and then we'll make that judgment call as we go. Just give them a quick scheduling update on that. With that, committee will come to order. Oversight and Government Relations Committee, we exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money that Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers do have the right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people, bring genuine reform to Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I would like to thank all the witnesses in both panels today for participating in today's hearing. I hope this is an informative hearing where witnesses can share best practices and form relationships going forward that will encourage our mutual due diligence. Federal government spends more than $500 billion on contracts each year. Most contractors are patriots who fulfill their contractual obligations to the Federal Government in spite of the mountains of Federal forms and frustrations. They provide indispensable products. They deliver quality services to Federal agencies. But unfortunately, this committee has examined instances in the past which certain contractors tried to defraud the government or they demonstrate a pattern of inability to deliver on their contractual commitments. One of the tools that agencies have to address this unethical, fraudulent, or chronically poor-performing contractors is the remedy of suspension and debarment. Today we will hear testimony that while some agencies are effective in using this administrative remedy to weed out bad actors who waste taxpayer dollars, other agencies are simply not fulfilling their responsibility to suspend or debar. This hearing will explore the following question. Why is it that some agencies are able to uncover problems with their contractors and take dozens of suspension and debarment actions each year, while other agencies with similar or larger contract spending initiate virtually no action? While I hope it is because some agencies have high-quality contractors and they have not experienced any contracting issues, it is unlikely that there are no poor-performing or dishonest contractors working for the agencies that have not suspended or debarred any contractors. Common sense would seem to suggest these agencies are not looking for and thus not uncovering fraud on the part of their contractors. In some cases, though, these agencies may simply accept poor performance or staff may not complete the follow-up paperwork or help others avoid the same bad contractors in the future. GAO's work bears out our suspicion that agencies that focus on using the tool of suspension and debarment and make it a priority are successful at rooting out future waste and fraud by excluding the contractor from future business with the government or forcing the contractor to take needed corrective measures. Clearly, it takes a concerted effort to identify candidates for suspension and debarment, develop the necessary factual record, and at the same time provide the required due process safeguards for contractors. The alternative, however, is not an option. Agencies that put in the necessary work to implement a robust suspension and debarment program can expect to see returns on their investment in terms of programmatic fraud or waste avoided. In addition, because of the government-wide exclusion that can result from suspension and debarment actions, having an effective suspension and debarment program also serves to strengthen the integrity of the overall contracting system. It sends a clear message that dishonest contractors or shoddy work will not be accepted, which protects taxpayer dollars from flowing to subpar contractors. This committee is a watchdog for the taxpayers' money, but we also think it is reasonable to expect each agency to be diligent, ferreting out bad actors they know in the contracting world so we can stop contracting fraud. The American people, they deserve our attention. I would also like to thank Chairman Towns, who held hearings on this same subject in 2009 and in 2010. He has put sunlight on this process, and we will continue to do that until it is fixed. I look forward to hearing the testimony today about how we can keep unethical contractors out of the Federal system. I now would like to recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Connolly, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this important hearing. The GAO report, in the context of the final report of the Commission on Wartime Contracting, which we heard the other day, should be a deafening alarm bell about wasteful spending that can be curbed through the use of functional suspension and disbarment programs. The National Security Subcommittee held a hearing last month examining potentially corrupt Department of Defense contracting in Afghanistan. Earlier this week, the Commission on Wartime Contracting told our committee that an estimated $31 to $60 billion has been lost to fraud or waste through contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan alone. What is most extraordinary about this figure is not how large it is, but that the Commission told us that it isn't even comprehensive. The Federal Government lacks not only the tools to manage overseas DoD contracts, but even the mechanisms to account fully for the money we lose. If there is one lesson we could learn from this experience, it should be that rushing into foreign wars unprepared can be incomprehensibly expensive. The GAO report we are considering today is just as troubling as the Commission on Wartime Contracting report. GAO reassures us that the Department of Defense, OIG, recently reported that the services and DLA had an effective suspension and debarment process, apparently based on the fact that DoD issues more suspensions and debarments than any other Federal agency. No wonder. Between 2006 and 2010, DoD spent $1,776 billion on contracting. That is to say, $1.7 trillion for those of us who would otherwise lose count of the zeros. It's approximately 15,000% more money than any other agency spent on contracts, so it should follow that DOD would also issue more suspensions and debarments. While it's very disturbing that some agencies have issued 0 suspensions and debarments, unless we're to assume that their contracts are pristine, given the volume of DOD contracts and relative paucity of suspensions and debarments relative to the amounts, we must be vigilant in reducing waste in that department. Rather than looking only at the total number of suspensions and debarments per agencies, maybe we should consider the number of suspension and debarments per contracting dollar. For each $1 billion DOD has spent on contracts, it issued an average of 0.9 suspensions and debarments. By contrast, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has a witness in today's hearing, has issued 42.6 suspensions or debarments per $1 billion of contracting dollars spent. By this measure, EPA would seem to be far more attentive to protecting taxpayer dollars, frankly, than DOD. Of course, the number of suspensions and debarments per contracting dollar is only informative if we know that there is some fraud or waste that the suspensions or debarments should address. The purpose of suspension and debarment is to protect the taxpayers, not to enact punitive measures against contractors, most of whom are patriotic Americans trying to serve the public, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman. In the case of DOD, we know from the recent Commission report, sadly, that such fraud and waste is so rampant in Iraq and Afghanistan as to be virtually unquantifiable. The United States has spent in excess of $200 billion in contingency contracting to support the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last decade. According to the final report of the Commission on Wartime Contracting, up to $60 billion of those taxpayer dollars were lost to waste, fraud, and abuse. It is imperative that we improve suspension and debarment procedures for DOD so that we don't repeat the waste of money identified by the Commission on Wartime Contracting. I greatly appreciate the willingness of representatives from GAO, DOD, HHS, DHS, and EPA to appear before us today to discuss this important topic. It's clear there's wide variation in the methodology used to determine suspension and debarment, and replicating best practices to reduce waste must be our urgent task so that those agencies have more uniformity and predictability in this process. And I thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conley. Members may have 7 days to submit opening statements and extraneous material for the record. We will now welcome our first panel. Mr. William T. Woods is the Director of Government Accountability Office in the Acquisition and Sourcing Management Team. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Mr. Woods, would you please rise and raise your right hand? Thank you. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. In order to allow time for discussion, and obviously we've already discussed as well the votes that are being called at some point, I'd like you to limit your testimony. You're the only member of this particular panel, and so 5 to 10 minutes will give you a little bit of flexibility in the time there, but we would like to be able to pummel you with random questions as well once we get through your testimony. So honored to be able to receive your testimony. Obviously, your written statement will be made a part of the record as well. You are recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Connolly. Thank you so much for inviting the Government Accountability Office to be here this morning to address what you both have recognized as an extremely important topic in the area of government contracting. We need a robust suspension and debarment process in order to ensure that the Federal Government does business only with responsible contractors, and that we avoid doing business with dishonest contractors, those that commit illegal acts, and those that are irresponsible and unethical. I am very pleased to be able to release our report this morning, which we did for this committee, as well as the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, addressing the suspension and debarment issue on a government-wide basis. That report is GAO-11-739, and with the permission of the committee, I'd like to have that inserted in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My statement today will cover the work that we did to prepare that report, the specific objectives that this committee asked us to address, our findings as a result of that work, and our recommendations. But first, I would like to provide just a very, very brief overview of the process. First of all, in terms of definitions, a suspension, both suspensions and debarments are exclusions from the Federal contracting process. Suspensions are a temporary remedy, generally lasting about 12 months. There is a provision for extending that up to 18 months if the Attorney General so requests. Debarments, on the other hand, are for a fixed period of time, generally 3 years, although those can be extended as well. Suspension and debarments are covered in some detail in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. There is also a parallel process for grants, assistance, loans, loan guarantees, and that sort of thing, which are covered under the Non-Procurement Common Rule, or NCR. But both procedures are somewhat similar, and they are reciprocal. In other words, if an entity is debarred under the Federal Acquisition Procedures rules, that entity is considered to be debarred as well under the Non-Procurement Common Rule, and vice versa. Our first objective was to determine what entities are listed on the excluded parties list system. The excluded parties list is a list maintained by the General Services Administration, an electronic online system that contains all of the entities that have been subject to suspension, proposed for debarment, or debarred. That, as I said, is maintained by the GSA. The individual agencies that take the actions are responsible for entering data, names, etc., into that EPLS system. And our first objective was really to understand what's in that system. Frankly, I was somewhat surprised at the numbers, because as indicated in my testimony, Figure 1 on page 4, the vast majority of entities that are listed as a result of statutory exclusions. For example, the Department of Health and Human Services might debar or exclude a contractor or an entity for health care fraud. Export control violations are another matter where statutes specifically provide that if a violation is found through a judicial process or in some cases an administrative process, the Congress has decided that those entities shall be listed on that excluded parties list system. Now, they may have had nothing to do with Federal contracts, but the consequence of listing on that system is that they are precluded from obtaining a Federal contract. When we looked at that, we found that about 84% of the cases in the excluded parties list system were as a result of these statutory debarments. The remaining 16% were either actions taken under the Federal Acquisition Regulation or actions taken under the Non-Procurement Common Rule. Our second objective was to look behind those numbers and to determine which agencies are active and which agencies are relatively inactive in the area of suspension and debarments. At the request of this committee, we focused just on the procurement-related actions, so on that 16% or so that are listed on the excluded parties list system as a result of either non-procurement common rule actions or actions under the Federal Acquisition Regulation. I refer you to Appendix 1 on page 10 of the statement that lists all of the major agencies, those that that have done about $2 billion or more in contracting over the period that we looked at. We looked back 5 years, from 2006 through 2010. And as you have already correctly pointed out, the Department of Defense is far and away the largest user of the suspension and debarment system. We wanted to get a snapshot and an idea of what are the variables at play and what are the reasons why some agencies appear to be quite active in this area and other agencies less active. So we chose a judgmental sample. We wanted to get a mix of defense and civilian agencies. Within defense, we chose the Navy and the Defense Logistics Agency. We wanted to look at some large agencies. We looked at Health and Human Services. We looked at the Department of Homeland Security. Within the Department of Homeland Security, we looked at two entities, one that appeared to be relatively active in the area, that was the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau, and one that appeared to be relatively inactive, that was the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We wanted to get a feel for what are the factors that really account for the variation in these numbers. And we found that three factors account for that variation. First, the agencies with the active programs have a dedicated program with dedicated staff. It happened that the staff on all of the four agencies that we looked at with active programs had dedicated full-time staff. The second factor was that each of the four agencies with the active programs, and for reference, you may want to refer to Figure 2 on page 5 of my statement, which has a graphic display of what I am outlining at this point. But the second factor that we found is that the active agencies had detailed policies and procedures, not just mirroring what is in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, but providing additional detail to their acquisition and non-acquisition personnel on how to deal with contractors that are poor performers, that have been convicted of certain transgressions, or are simply unethical. But detailed policies and procedures were an important component of an active process. And the third component was an active referral process. And what that means is that agencies went out of their way to train people on how to take advantage of the suspension and debarment process. They had active inspectors general who routinely made referrals to the suspension and debarment official. They had contracting officers who would also make a practice of making referrals to the suspension and debarment official. So those are the three factors that we found at the four agencies with the most active programs. Conversely, we found at 6 agencies that had less active programs, we found an absence of those three factors. Our third objective, and again at the request of this committee, was to take a look at the interagency coordination process. For that, we looked first at the committee that called the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee. This is a committee that was created by executive order in the mid-'80s. Recently, it received statutory recognition and statutory direction in the 2009 Defense Authorization Act, where Congress outlined specific responsibilities for this interagency committee. So we wanted to take a look at how that committee was functioning and what are the challenges that it was facing. Briefly stated, the main function of that committee is to serve as the lead agency determination forum. When an entity may be running afoul of the law, may be suspected of some conduct that might lead to a suspension or debarment, the first issue on the table is which agency ought to take responsibility to pursue that. And that question gets resolved at this Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee. They often act very quickly through an email process or telephone to quickly decide on which agency needs to step forward and take responsibility for pursuing either a suspension or debarment against the entity. But we found that this interagency committee faced challenges. First major challenges was resources. They have no dedicated personnel. They have no budget. And we found that raised some issues for that committee in terms of having to borrow staff from the members that actually, from the chair and the vice chair in particular, that actually sit on that committee. The second challenge that they faced was participation. There are members on the committee from all of the major agencies and many of the second-tier agencies, if you will, that do less activity in the procurement arena in terms of dollar spending. But participation in the monthly meetings of that committee is not what it really should be. There are many agencies that simply do not participate to the level that one would expect for this important area. And they were challenged, for example, in preparing a report that the Congress directed in that legislation that I referred to earlier. Congress directed them to prepare a report on their activities and the activities of their member organizations. And it took quite a while for them to get the cooperation of all of the agencies in order to prepare and submit that congressionally required report. We had a number of recommendations in our report, and just very briefly, first of all, we wanted, for the 6 agencies that had the relatively inactive programs, we wanted them to adopt the practices that we outlined that we found at the agencies that had an active process. All of the agencies concurred in that recommendation. Our second set of recommendations was directed to the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget, and that was for the Office of Federal Procurement Policy to issue a memorandum to all Federal agencies outlining what it takes to have an active, robust suspension and debarment program. Secondly, we wanted the Office of Federal Procurement Policy to require and provide guidance to all agencies to cooperate with the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my prepared statement, and I would be happy to respond to questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. And with that, I recognize myself. Thank you for your report. It is very thorough, and we do appreciate that and the details that you put into it from there. You answered several of my questions that I had initially, and that was dealing with the factors, both that the 3 consistent factors that you saw, and then those that were not being effective in suspension and debarment, those 3 factors being absent as well. So that's very helpful to know. When you talk about dedicated staff, how many staff are you talking about typically in these agencies? Is this 1,000 people? Is this 4 people?
Yeah, it did vary. Sometimes it was only 1 or 2 people. Sometimes it was more than 10, less than 20.
Okay. So it's a small group from the agency that's been set aside and specifically tasked full-time to that.
It ranged in terms of full-time, sir. Some of the agencies did have full-time dedicated staff, but other agencies had part-time staff or staff that who had other responsibilities, but one of their major responsibilities was to make the suspension and debarment process work.
Okay. Did you see a shift in effectiveness? Was it basically the size of the program where one agency may be very large, for instance, Department of the Navy that you talked about before, obviously very large, a lot of contracts there, they would submit a larger staff, another agency with fewer people. Did you see a correlation in that as far as number of people that were involved?
Yeah. We did not see a correlation. We did see differences, and as you pointed out, the Navy had one of the larger staffs, and many of them were full-time. But we did not observe a correlation between the size of the staff and the effectiveness of the program.
Okay. The actual process of suspension and debarment that they have to go through, the paperwork to fill out, to complete, is there anything in that process that you determined, you know what, this is bulky, this is difficult, this is a disincentive to do suspension and debarment based on the actual bureaucratic red tape of doing it? So is there anything you discovered in that?
The process is relatively straightforward. The process is also in the regulation. It specifically requires that agency adopt an informal process as possible to avoid that kind of red tape. One of the hallmarks of the system is the action needs to be taken quickly, because the whole purpose of suspensions and debarments is to protect the government's interest. And often we need to move very quickly in order to be able to do that. And so the Federal Acquisition Regulation requires that the procedures be streamlined and as informal as possible.
Obviously, we will be visiting with people as we go through this from HHS or FEMA and other things that you mentioned as well in your report on that. Specific recommendations that you have made, as you have made those recommendations, they have been received well by those agencies. Do you think it was just a matter of very busy in other areas and just didn't pay attention to the suspension and debarment areas? What did you discover from that, and what's the follow-up been like?
Sure. Well, first of all, we were very pleased that all of the agencies concurred with the recommendations. And what we found during the course of the review is that even at the agencies that had the less active programs, that steps were being taken at each of the agencies to get serious about the suspension and debarment process. And there is a description in the report of several agencies with specific steps that those agencies are taking to do that.
Okay, let me shift gears on you a little bit. The statutory exclusions, I know that was not a part of your total research on that. How do you feel like that is being applied, and who puts that on the list? So when it is not a bad actor in the sense it's a statutory exclusion for whatever reason, how are they getting on that list, and who is managing getting them off of that list? Sure.
Well, for example, let's take health care fraud. That would fall within the bailiwick of Health and Human Services. That agency would be responsible for putting entities that have run afoul of health care provisions, be it payment provisions or outright health care fraud. They would be responsible for putting those entities on the list.
Okay, so they're getting them on there. Who is responsible for getting them off? If they've been cleared, let's say it's been 5 years. Let's say, is it an automatic removal on that, or for those statutory areas, are they lifetime?
Well, very often the statute will provide for a specific period of time, be it years or whatever. And when that period has expired, those entities should no longer be listed.
Okay, but that is automatically being pulled. The agency is not having to pursue to go back and say this needs to be pulled now. It's now been 3 years.
I believe so, but you may want to ask the second panel about that.
I want to just be able to make sure, obviously, that people that have been debarred for a period of time that is actually pulled off, and so they can be redeemed, I guess, at the end of it. Let's talk real quickly about grants as well. You mentioned, obviously, grants and the contracting world being together and this reciprocal list on it. Just in your overview and looking at it, is that a good thing to be able to have grants and contractors together on this reciprocal list? And if so, are agencies effective on getting to the list? This is a bad actor in the grant world, and so that people in the contracting world can also know that as well.
Well, we do not have any insight into the grant process because our review was just focused on contracts. Okay. But the reciprocal nature is one that the Congress decided in the mid-90s ought to be part of the system, and we didn't come across any reason to think that that was an unwise decision either then or now.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Woods. With that, I yield to Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Woods. By the way, where are you from?
I'm from the Boston area originally. Is my accent giving me away?
A little bit.
Okay.
Fully rounded vowels.
I wish Mr. Lynch were here. So.
Well, I also am from Boston.
I see.
But Mr. Lynch talks more like you than I do, probably, yes. Thank you for your testimony. How often does suspension and debarment occur based purely on non-performance criteria?
There are various codes in the system. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question as to the frequency. But that is something that one could use the codes, because when an agency enters an entity into the system, they are also required to use one of the many codes so that someone could identify the reason that the entity is listed and to be in a position to answer your question.
It just seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that non-performance ought to be one of the reasons somebody is, yeah, it's a pretty big one. You make the point, well said, that obviously different agencies are subjected to different statutory criteria, and therefore they have to conform to that, and that explains some variation among Federal agencies for terms and conditions for suspension and debarment. But surely there ought to be a uniform process in every agency so that we don't have the kind of variation you've described in terms of active programs and less active programs. What is the reason for the fact that some agencies have inactive programs?
I think it's that they haven't paid sufficient attention to it. We found HHS, for example, is very active in the Medicare fraud area, and in fact has a substantial number of entities listed. But when you look on the procurement side, and that agency spends a fair amount of procurement dollars, but we were surprised to see that over the 4-year period that we looked at, they had no suspensions and debarments based on the Federal Acquisition Regulation.
Huh. That's astounding. You cited the fact that DOD had the most, but of course, as I said in my opening statement, that's to be expected. But if you actually looked at it on a per billion-dollar contracting dollar, if you will, actually they're far below some other agencies like EPA. Given the fact, I don't know, are you familiar with the report of the Commission on Wartime Contracting that we heard from the other day?
I have looked at that report, yes, sir.
So the fact that there's an estimate of $31 to $60 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse, how many contractors were debarred or suspended based on that finding? Do you know?
I don't know that, sir.
Presumably there ought to be some.
One would think.
Yes. I mean, if it's at the higher end, you're matching Medicare fraud, waste, and abuse.
That's certainly a lot of money, and we were pleased that the Commission did focus on that and had specific recommendations as to how to improve the process.
Is conflict of interest one of the reasons for suspension and debarment?
I don't believe that that is listed in the Federal Acquisition Regulation as one of the specific causes called out in the regulation.
But if a determination is made that there is a conflict of interest, that you engage in a conflict of interest either in the RFP process or the proposal writing process or whatever it might be, you could be subject to being listed and prevented from contracting for some period of time. Is that not correct?
Yes, sir. There is catch-all language, if you will, in the Federal Acquisition Regulation that permits the suspension and debarment official to take action for other reasons that that official considers so serious as to warrant listing on the system.
One of the criticisms one hears sometimes from contractors about that is that it can be, first of all, the penalty is severe, and conflict of interest can sometimes be very much subjective judgment. For example, you may be a large contractor and you've been asked to provide your expertise for a Federal advisory panel, scientific panel, defense panel, intelligence panel. And even in advance, I know of cases where consent was gotten that if we do that, we don't want to be prevented from bidding on some contracts. And subsequently, somebody comes along in the IG's office and determines, wait a minute, you were on this panel and you've bid on a contract, you won the contract, and we call that a conflict, and you're going to be listed. And so, my time's up, but how are we also making sure that when we decide to sort of lower the boom, that we have determined that this is fair and that the entity has had a fair opportunity to make its case?
A couple of things. First of all, the decision to list someone or to exclude the party would be made by the agency's suspension and debarment official, not by the Inspector General or anyone else that might suspect wrongdoing.
But the IG's office may be determining there is a conflict of interest.
And they would then therefore make a referral to the suspension and debarment official. The other safeguard is that there are procedures for the entity to bring contrary facts, to make arguments to the suspension and debarment official as to why they should not be listed.
Thank you. My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Walberg is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Woods, for being here and for the work GAO does. Your report found that agencies with a quarter of the contract obligations of HHS have significantly more activity in this area. Specifically, the Department of Interior, with annual contract obligations of approximately $23 billion, had 94% procurement-related or 94 procurement-related actions and 10 grant-related suspension and debarment actions. Department of Transportation, with contract obligations of approximately $23 billion, had 11 procurement-related suspensions or debarments and 193 grant-related actions. HHS, in contrast, though, has $80 billion in contract obligations, and during the same time period had 0 procurement-related actions and 29 grant actions. In your opinion, is HHS failing in regards to suspension and debarment?
We were surprised at those numbers as well, sir. We did not look at the two agencies, Interior and Transportation, but when we did look at Health and Human Services, we were surprised at the number, the absence of any activity in the suspension and debarment arena, given the size of their procurement spending.
What it does or did it lack in this area, and would this have been something? Is this something that you would say, judging by all of the other studies that you did, is acceptable?
In response to your first question, they lacked the 3 attributes that we specifically found at the agencies with the active programs. They lacked the dedicated staff, the policies and procedures, and the active referral process. When we talked to the officials at Health and Human Services, they in fact acknowledged that the suspension and debarment tool was underutilized at their agency.
Okay. Going along that line then, if you could explain what you mean by detailed policies or guidance.
Certainly.
What does that look like?
Certainly. At one level, the Federal Acquisition Regulation provides the policies and procedures, and it is quite detailed. But we would expect to see, and in fact what we found at the agencies with the active programs, was even further detail in their implementing guidance. In other words, roles and responsibilities. Who actually implements and is charged with implementing the various provisions in the Federal Acquisition Regulation? We found those answers in the 4 agencies. We did not find those answers at the other agencies.
Okay. Okay. I yield back. Thank
you for yielding on that. Let me do one quick follow-up question if the gentleman will yield.
I will yield.
Just to clarify, if these agencies, very large as they may be, would just reassign 2 or 3 people to focus in on that, we have the potential of finding a lot of bad contractors that we can protect the rest of the Federal Government from through suspension and debarment. So we are not talking about a massive shift in agencies. We are talking about even reassigning 2 or 3 people. Is that correct?
We are not talking about a massive shift. And in fact, some of the agencies complained to us that they are not in a position to devote full-time people. They are not in a position to hire people. And we understand that in today's budget environment. But reassigning people or carving out some part-time responsibility for individuals, for even a small number of individuals, would have the kind of impact that you just described, sir.
Terrific. Thank you for yielding, Mr. Walberg. Mr. Murphy is recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I want to talk to you a little bit about the portion of your testimony related to the Interagency Suspension and Debarment Committee. The 2009 Defense Authorization gives them some increased powers and responsibilities, but you clearly seem to suggest that there is a lot more that they could do. They're a coordinating agency, but they've got very little teeth. What specifically would you recommend that we do in order to give that committee the kind of teeth that would, at the very least, allow them to collect more information or get the people that do not have active programs at the table, or maybe at an even sort of next level, give them actual give them something more than just the power to convene and monitor. What do you suggest we do there?
We think the action needs to come from the Office of Federal Procurement Policy. And we think it would be relatively simple and straightforward for the Office of Federal Procurement Policy to issue guidance to all Federal agencies to cooperate much more fully with the Interagency Committee in terms of participation in the process, in terms of responding to data requests, in terms of providing staff where possible to support the activities of that committee.
Does that committee have enough staff?
That committee does not have any dedicated staff.
Okay. So where does that committee staff come from?
The chair and the vice chair, at least during the period of our review, would use their own resources from their home agency to carry out the activities of the committee.
So let's say that directive comes down and there's a requirement that that data and information is provided. The question is, so what? What does that really do, just to have more information or more resources at the Interagency's committee if they don't really have any power to compel particular agencies to step up and change their practices?
I'm not sure that's really needed. We have the Office of Management and Budget that has the kind of teeth that you were referring to. We have the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within OMB who's charged with responsibility for making this system work. We think the pieces, the mechanisms are there. It's just a question of using those mechanisms.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. And with that, Mr. Woods, I appreciate very much your testimony. I'd like to take a short recess in order for the clerks to be able to prepare for our second panel. We will try to do the testimony of our second panel and get that into the record, and then we may have to come back to be able to pummel you with questions and be able to go through that process. And with that, we'll take a short recess.
Mr. Chairman, could I just, before Mr. Woods goes?
You most certainly may.
Just a quick question. I think you, legislatively, would it be helpful, do you think, if we had some legislation that tightened up some of the reporting requirements and standardization issues your report has covered?
I'm not sure additional legislation is needed at this point. The Congress was very clear a couple of years ago on the importance of the Interagency Committee, on the roles and responsibilities that the Congress expected that committee to play. The Administration issued a change to the Federal Acquisition Regulation to reinforce and implement the direction that the Congress gave. I think, again, the pieces are there. It's just a question of managing that and stressing the importance of this area.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I would think a day like today does stress the importance of that area.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. We'll take a short recess and reset. I'd like to go ahead and begin if we can. We'll now welcome our second panel. Mr. Stephen Shaw is the Deputy General Counsel for Contractor Responsibility at the Department of the Air Force, where he also serves as the Air Force Suspension and Debarment Official. Mr. Richard Pelletier is the Suspension and Debarment Official for the Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Nick Nyack is the Chief Procurement Officer at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Nancy Gunderson is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Grants and Acquisition Policy and Accountability for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where she also serves as the Department's Suspension and Debarment Official. As I had mentioned before, we are watching for votes. We are tracking through those. We should have enough time to be able to get everyone's opening statement into that. So pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. Would you please rise and raise your right hands? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give this committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. Thank you. In order to allow time for discussion, I am going to ask that you do limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Your entire written statement, of course, will be made a part of the written record, and any other written documents that you would like to submit to this committee we will include. I now would like to recognize Mr. Shaw for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Connolly, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me here today. This is a very important subject that's dear to my heart. I've been doing this for 15 years and find it to be extremely important. I also want to thank GAO for an outstanding report in this area. Even though they didn't address the Air Force, they addressed some important issues. Their recommendations are recommendations that we agree with. We have the 3 elements of active programs that they talk about. We have a dedicated staff. We have written processes and procedures, and we have practices that encourage referrals. I'm hesitating on the referrals a little bit because one of the features of the Air Force is not to rely upon referrals. Referrals are important. Procedures to increase referrals are important, but we do a lot more than deal with our inbox and respond to referrals from other agencies, and I'll get to that in a second. The areas that are somewhat unique perhaps to the Air Force, or at least are why we are strong in this area, we think, are both structural and policy related. And the structural areas are the full-time dedicated staff. We have, through the entire 15 years of my tenure in this position and before that, had a full-time staff, and more recently we've expanded that to full-time field staff in the AFMC, the Air Force Materiel Command, and in headquarters for the non-MAGCOMs. So we have additional attorneys. So they're somewhat upwards of 10 or 15 attorneys that we have in the Air Force, even though there are only 3 in my office in headquarters Air Force. Another unique part is that I'm a full-time debarring official, and that's very unusual in the Federal Government. I personally think that's extremely important, and I praise the Air Force for doing that. It was before my time. It has nothing to do with me, but I think that's an important feature. There are only 3 or 4 agencies in the whole Federal Government that have the full-time debarring official, and I think that's an important feature for some of the reasons that I'll talk about. Also, separation from the acquisition chain, I think, is critical in this area. The Air Force and the whole DoD started doing this in the early 90s as a result of a IG report, DoD IG report, recommending that it be structured that way. And I agree with them, and I think that the Defense Department is doing that correctly in that way. We're independent of the acquisition chain. We certainly coordinate with them, and they are partners with us. But I don't wait or expect the acquisition people to approve of what I'm doing. I'm empowered to do what is right. And that's the third important feature of the Air Force, and that is the empowerment. The senior leaders of the Air Force and of DoD have supported what I've done throughout my tenure, recognize this as an independent area. I coordinate everything, but I am empowered to do what's right, and the examples that I used in the written testimony attest to that. And then another feature is perhaps it's unusual or unique to the Defense Department, and that's the Fraud Remedies Program I also manage within the Air Force. So I'm overseeing 2 missions. One is coordinating and making sure the Air Force gets all of the remedies, criminal, civil, contract, and administrative, done. And we are the inside lawyers, really, for the Justice Department in making those kinds of decisions. So because of that, we have real visibility into cases, and we can reach out and do suspensions and debarments even when nobody refers them to us. And that is where the outreach and the proactiveness that I was talking about comes in, where we don't wait for referrals. We monitor cases from the investigators, their case status reports. If there's some case that looks like it's necessary to do a suspension or debarment to protect the interest of the government, we will reach out to that investigator, ask for the report, and we'll do a debarment, even though nobody is asking us to do that debarment. And even if people are objecting to it, we're going to do it if that's the right thing to do. On the policy side of this, the fact-based cases is an important part of what we do. I think there's a lot of agencies that only do debarments or suspensions where there's an indictment or a conviction. And I think that's ill-advised. That's just delegating all of your power to the Justice Department. If they don't have the resources to do a case, they won't do it. But we in the Air Force are still worried about that. So we will reach out and do a debarment anyway, based upon facts. Also, it's not important or not necessary to do contract actions. I mean, it is not, the power of a debarment under the FAR is not limited to fraud in a government contract. If an Air Force contractor, for example, is committing fraud on a commercial case or personal income tax evasion or anything more than jaywalking, probably, we are going to be concerned about it, because if they're defrauding a commercial customer, they're going to defraud us. And finally, the carrot and the stick we use. I talk about this a lot. Because of the stick of debarment, we're able to influence proactively the defense industry, I think. And we go out and talk to the defense industry, and we give them incentives to improve their programs and processes to avoid the fraud at the front end. So we're trying to limit fraud and do risk management rather than solely doing the stick of debarment. And with that, I thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Mr. Peltier.
Thank you, Chairman Langford and Ranking Member Connolly and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity to speak about the EPA suspension and debarment program. I'm a suspension debarment official, or the SDO, for the agency. Since 1981, EPA has had a robust program. Historically, it's been the leader in this area. For example, my predecessor was the chairman of the ISDC, which you've heard some testimony about, for 20 years. Also in 2003, with members of the Air Force, DLA, and GSA, we formulated, the EPA actually led the formation of the National Suspension and Debarment Training Program, which is offered through the FLETC, through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center down in Glencoe, Georgia. Currently, I am still the coordinator for that program, and also EPA provides 3 of the 6 instructors for the 3 or 4 courses that we offer each year. Now, the EPA program has really 2 elements to it. It has a statutory debarments, and it also has the discretionary. The statutory are the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act, and the discretionaries can be taken under either the non-procurement rule, which you've heard some testimony about, as well as the FAR Part 9.4. At EPA, we almost exclusively use the non-procurement common rule. At our office, we have in the EPA, we have 2 separate offices that deal with suspension and debarment program. There's my office. As a suspension debarment official, I have a hearing officer and a program analyst. We also have a suspension and debarment division, which has a director. It has 7 attorneys. It has a paralegal, 2 investigators, an auditor, and some support, administrative support personnel. All of us are full-time, and this is all we do is suspension and debarment. The way the cases work at EPA, the suspension debarment, the division attorneys develop the case in close coordination with the OIG, for example, or the Office of Enforcement that we have, or any other state or federal investigative body, or any public or private source that may provide us with information. Like Mr. Shaw says, we do fact-based cases as well. We coordinate, or the division attorneys coordinate through the ISDC for lead agency, and then it's referred to my office for an action. And then when proper notice, we provide the respondents the opportunity to be heard, to present information and arguments in opposition to the proposed debarment. When I make a final decision, it is on behalf of not only the EPA but all federal agencies. Now, under the EPA non-procurement rule, as we have implemented it at EPA, there is an additional safeguard in that the respondent can appeal my decision to the Director of the Office of Grants and Debarment prior to taking any court action under the Administrative Procedures Act. Just as a frame of reference, and the numbers are not magical, but just as a frame of reference, in the last fiscal year, our initial numbers indicated we took 98 proposed debarments, 111 suspensions, 115 discretionary debarments, and approximately 42 statutory debarments. Also, we entered into 3 administrative agreements. Now, the rate of EPA dollars spent procurement to non-procurement is approximately 4 to 1, and that is why we use the non-procurement rule rather than the FAR. Both rules are reciprocal, so you can, of course, any action under one is binding on the other. Also, you can use a non-procurement rule for acquisition as well as non-acquisition matters. So it is available if you want to do it for a contract direct acquisition process. The written guidance that EPA has, we have implemented, for example, the non-procurement rule is implemented by the agencies. We did that through our 2 CFR 1532. But also over the years, we have supplemented with written guidance, SOPs, best practices that are been learned since 1981, and put those into a written form so it can be continued and consistently updated as we go through the process. Another factor that is important is my superiors actively encourage our involvement not only with the ISDC, but also with other agents, other organizations that are involved in this, such as the ABA Subcommittee on Suspension and Debarment. We are very proud of our rich history of protecting the taxpayers' dollars. We continue with this effort, and even in these hard times, we have been able to continue to have the personnel necessary, and I am pleased to be able to talk about it today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. As you have just heard, the votes have been called on. I would like to receive both of your opening statements, and then we will scoot out for a recess from there. So, Mr. Nyack.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Ranking Member. I will abbreviate my statement and hope that it helps you guys. I am the Chief Procurement Officer for DHS, overall contracting at DHS. Sort of in a nutshell, we get this, and we are going to get it right. We are going to be a best practice agency. Prior to my arrival, and I have been here for a little bit less than a year, there was an IG review of DHS suspension and debarment. We took that to heart. The Undersecretary for Management, who is my boss, put together a task force. We studied all of the best practice organizations. The Immigration Customs Enforcement is one of those best practices within DHS that we studied. We came out with a model, and since I've been on board, so a little bit less than a year, the Secretary approved a new program for suspension and debarment. It follows all of the best practices the GAO outlined. We are committed to getting this right. We are going to have dedicated staff. We are going to have detailed policies and procedures. We are going to have an active referral process. And we are going to have a system for tracking referrals, suspensions, and debarments. And this is going to happen in short order, so we look forward to following up with the committee over time. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nyack. And you are right, you definitely abbreviated. I appreciate from there. Ms. Gunderson.
Thank you. Chairman Langford, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you to discuss the Department of Health and Human Services grants and acquisition policies and practices, and in particular our use of suspension and debarment in our oversight practices. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grants and Acquisition Policy and Accountability, I serve as the Department's suspension and debarment official, and am responsible for providing department-wide leadership in the areas of grants and acquisition management. My office oversees and supports the Department's 13 grants management offices and 10 procurement activities as they award and administer grants and contracts in fulfilling HHS's mission to enhance the health and well-being of Americans. Fighting fraud and ensuring program integrity are central to fulfilling the Department's mission, and we appreciate the work of this subcommittee and the GAO in highlighting the policies and practices from which HHS may learn. The Department is committed to the effective use of suspension and debarment as a tool to support successful grant and acquisition management. HHS also believes that comprehensive pre-award source selection and post-award administration practices help ensure satisfactory performance and reduce our need to resort to suspension and debarment as we focus our resources on these practices. As reported by the GAO, HHS debarred 29 grant recipients between 2006 and 2010. In fiscal year 2011, we also debarred 6 grant recipients, and these debarment cases were based on financial misconduct as investigated by our Office of the Inspector General and scientific misconduct as investigated by our Office of Research Integrity in cooperation with the affected universities and research institutions. Through our contract administration processes from fiscal year 2009 through 2011, HHS terminated approximately 12 contracts for default. In these cases, the associated performance issues were not so serious in nature to impose either suspension or debarment. In light of the GAO's recommendations and an effort to strengthen our suspension and debarment processes, we are in discussions on how best to dedicate staff and resources to this function and related oversight activities, in particular to create a contractor integrity team. We are currently assessing the policies and practices of other agencies for contract-related suspension and debarment in order to tailor best practices to our organization and issue detailed policies and procedures. We also intend to create an electronic desk reference to implement the new policy and provide our contracting officers with associated reference materials and uniform decision-making tools regarding referrals for suspension and debarment, financial responsibility determinations, and other performance remedies. Additionally, we also plan to establish an electronic case referral and tracking process for both grant and contract-related concerns, which will enable HHS to monitor and follow through on each case and identify consistent themes and vulnerabilities. Finally, these policies and practices will be reinforced through communication and training to ensure HHS's grants and acquisition communities understand their responsibilities and are able to identify and refer cases of fraud, misconduct, and the abuse of the public's trust in the Department's grants and acquisition programs. HHS strongly agrees with the need to protect taxpayer dollars and is committed to using its grants and acquisition management practices to serve as careful stewards of these funds. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee and about HHS's use of suspension and debarment in dealing with its grantees and contractors. I'm glad to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Gunderson. With that, I'd like to take a short recess. Let me give you an update on what we have. We have several votes and then a motion to recommit, unless you want to talk everybody out of doing a motion to recommit down there. No? Okay. So it'll take about probably 40 minutes or so, I would say, on our votes and our time to be able to come back. We will get restarted here as soon as we can with our questions, and we'll reengage. Again, I apologize for the delay, but we'll stay in recess until we have finished up voting. Thank you.